The day had started like any other in the busy city, with people rushing through crowded streets, taxis honking, and the smell of street food mixing with the cool morning air. Among the crowd, a young billionaire walked with quiet confidence, dressed sharply in a tailored suit that hinted at wealth but not arrogance. He was known in the business world as someone who rarely made mistakes, someone meticulous and disciplined, whose life was organized down to the last detail. Yet today, despite all his careful planning, he was about to step into a situation that would completely shake his world. As he strolled down the busy boulevard, he was mentally reviewing the day ahead, meetings, calls, and decisions that could impact millions of dollars. He had a calm focus, a kind of aura that made people give him space as he passed. But the city had its own rhythm, and sometimes, no matter how careful one was, life had a way of throwing surprises. Among the crowd, a young girl weaved her way skillfully through people, her movements quick and practiced. She wore ordinary clothes, nothing flashy, blending perfectly with the busy morning crowd. But there was an intensity in her eyes, a mix of fear and determination, that made her different from anyone else on the street. She was not reckless, she was careful, calculating, and aware of every glance and every step she took. Life had taught her to survive, sometimes by bending the rules, and today she had a plan. A risky plan, but one she felt she had no choice but to execute. The billionaire, engrossed in his thoughts, did not notice the girl until it was too late. She bumped into him lightly, almost casually, apologizing in a voice that sounded genuine. He barely looked at her, distracted by the numbers running through his mind, the meetings ahead, and the strategies he needed to perfect. Then, in a quick, almost invisible movement, she brushed past him, and in the same moment, his wallet disappeared from his coat pocket. At first he didn't notice. He continued walking, thinking about the day. But a few steps later, when he reached for his wallet to check his schedule or pay for a coffee, panic surged through him. The wallet was gone. He stopped abruptly, scanning the crowd around him. People were moving, talking, rushing by, but no one seemed suspicious. Yet he knew it had to be taken by someone nearby. His sharp mind immediately went into problem-solving mode. He had lost a wallet before, but never in such a precise, almost invisible way. The realization hit him harder than he expected. This was not just a lost item, it was a violation of his space, his privacy, and the order he cherished so much. For a moment, he felt anger rising, a rare emotion that he did not often experience. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to spot anyone acting strangely. And then he caught a glimpse of her, a young girl, ordinary in appearance, but with eyes that seemed aware of more than she should be. She walked quickly, blending into the crowd, and in that instant he knew. He knew she had his wallet. The billionaire, despite his calm exterior, felt a rush of adrenaline. He had the instinct to chase, to confront, but he also had the restraint that had built his fortune and reputation. He weighed his options quickly. Should he call security, alert the police, or handle it himself? The thought of tracking her personally, understanding how she had done it, and recovering what was his appeal to him. There was something about the audacity of her act that intrigued him, something that made this encounter more than just a petty theft. As he began to follow her through the streets, careful not to lose sight, he noticed the way she moved, quick, confident, yet cautious, as if she had done this many times before. He could feel the energy of the city around them, the rhythm of people rushing by, the sounds of horns, conversations, and footsteps creating a chaotic backdrop to this unexpected chase. It was thrilling in a strange way, a mix of anger, curiosity, and anticipation. In those moments, a story began to unfold, a story that neither of them could predict. The billionaire, used to controlling every aspect of his life, was about to be pulled into a world entirely unfamiliar to him. And the girl, trying to survive one more day, was about to cross paths with someone whose life was completely different from hers, someone whose wealth and influence could change everything. The encounter, simple on the surface, a wallet stolen, a pursuit begun, was the start of something much larger. It was the spark that would ignite a series of events neither of them could have imagined. A collision of two worlds that should have never met but were now intertwined by fate, circumstance, and a stolen wallet. And so the chase had begun. The city, with all its noise and chaos, became the stage for a game neither of them had planned but both were now unwilling participants in. The billionaire, whose life had always been orderly, now found himself navigating through crowded streets, trying to keep up with a girl who seemed to vanish into the throng of people with effortless ease. His mind raced faster than his steps. Strategies, calculations, possibilities, all while adrenaline surged through him in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time he was not in control, and the unpredictability thrilled him even as it frustrated him. She moved with purpose, but there was a rhythm to her movements, a practiced grace that suggested this was not the first time she had relied on speed, stealth, and quick thinking to escape danger. Her eyes flicked constantly to her surroundings, scanning the streets for escape routes, corners to hide behind, or alleys that could give her a sudden advantage. She wasn't reckless, she was deliberate, calculating every step, every turn, every potential observer. To her, this chase was survival, a challenge to maintain control over a life that had given her very few options. The billionaire's first thought was that he would rely on traditional methods, security cameras, police reports, and discreet inquiries. But as he followed her through the streets, weaving between pedestrians and dodging the occasional street vendor, he realized she was elusive in ways technology couldn't immediately capture. His instincts told him she wasn't just a petty thief. There was intelligence in her movements, an awareness that suggested life had taught her lessons harsher than any law enforcement could. As he pursued her, he began to notice the subtle details, the way she paused briefly to catch her breath but never slowed her pace, the way she glanced back without panicking, the way her fingers clutched something, perhaps the wallet, perhaps something else, close to her chest. Every move she made seemed to tell a story, one that he was now desperate to understand. The chase was no longer simply about recovering a wallet. It had become a puzzle, a mystery wrapped in motion, and he found himself fascinated. He tried to stay calm, but the city had its obstacles. Crowds surged unpredictably, cars honked insistently, and pedestrians bumped into him without apology. Yet even amid the chaos, he noticed her ability to adapt, slipping through narrow spaces, ducking into small alleyways, and disappearing briefly behind shop fronts. His admiration grew, though grudgingly, for her skill and cunning. Here was someone who could evade him, a man whose resources and intelligence had never before been tested against such raw survival instinct. She sensed he was following her but seemed unafraid. Perhaps she had done this before, perhaps she thrived on being chased, or perhaps she simply understood that fear was a luxury she could not afford. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but there was determination in every stride, a resolve forged by years of hardship and necessity. Each step she took was a declaration. She would not be caught, not easily, and certainly not by someone whose world seemed untouchable. Meanwhile, the billionaire had begun to learn the value of patience. He couldn't rush recklessly and risk losing sight of her. He needed strategy, observation, and timing. Each turn she made became a clue, each pause a potential opportunity. He started predicting her moves, noticing patterns in her behavior, imagining where she might go next. The chase was transforming into a mental game, a duel of wits played out on the crowded streets of the city, and he realized that his pursuit was no longer fueled solely by anger. It was now driven by curiosity, intrigue, and a grudging respect for her abilities. Hours, or at least it felt like hours, passed as the pursuit continued, turning the bustling city into a labyrinth where every corner held potential danger or opportunity. The billionaire began to see more than just a thief in her. He saw resilience, courage, and intelligence. Each step she took was not just a step away from him, but a step in a life shaped by struggle, sacrifice, and unyielding determination. And while he still wanted his wallet, he was beginning to wonder about the story behind the girl who had dared to take it. By the end of the morning, both were exhausted yet still unbroken. The chase had shifted something inside them. She had proven her strength, her cunning, and her survival instinct. He had discovered that even someone used to absolute control could be challenged, even humbled, by the unexpected. Neither could predict what would happen next, but the encounter had already changed the trajectory of their lives. The chase had begun as a quest for a lost wallet, but it had grown into something far more profound. A confrontation between two worlds, two realities, and two very different lives, now inexplicably intertwined. And so, the pursuit continued, not just through the streets of the city, but into the lives of both the billionaire and the girl, setting the stage for discoveries neither of them could have anticipated, and a truth that would eventually leave him completely silent. After the morning chase, the billionaire found himself momentarily paused at the edge of a busy intersection, trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. The girl had vanished into the maze of streets like a shadow, leaving behind more questions than answers. He could not stop thinking about her, not just because of the audacity of the theft, but because there was something in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that hinted at a story far deeper than a simple act of stealing. Driven by curiosity, he decided to learn more, to uncover the reality behind the girl who had challenged him in a way no one else ever had. Over the next few days, he began to observe from a distance, using subtle surveillance techniques and discreet inquiries. What he discovered was a world entirely different from the polished, controlled life he had always known. The girl lived in a cramped apartment at the edge of the city, a place filled with the noise of daily struggle and the quiet desperation of survival. The rooms were modest, almost bare, but hints of her personality peeked through. A small collection of books stacked in a corner, worn photographs on the wall, and a single potted plant struggling to survive on the windowsill. Each detail painted a picture of a life shaped by resilience rather than luxury. He learned that she was responsible for more than just herself. A younger sibling, sick and vulnerable, depended on her for everything: food, shelter, medicine, and even hope. The girl's days began before dawn and stretched into the late hours of night, filled with odd jobs, errands, and sacrifices that would have crushed someone less determined. She worked tirelessly, sometimes taking risks that most people would avoid, just to ensure her siblings' survival. The billionaire, watching from afar, began to feel a mix of admiration and disbelief. He had lived a life of comfort, guided by rules and opportunities that seemed natural to him, yet here was someone navigating a world far harsher, yet managing to survive with intelligence, courage, and integrity. He also discovered her cleverness. Every step she took, every shortcut she chose, every decision she made had purpose. She was not reckless or careless. She was resourceful, learning from mistakes and thinking several moves ahead. Even stealing the wallet, which had initially seemed like a reckless act, suddenly took on a new meaning. It wasn't done out of malice or greed but necessity, a choice made in desperation in a moment where survival outweighed morality. The realization struck him. This was a person whose life was filled with hardships he could scarcely imagine, a person forced into situations he had never faced, yet navigating them with courage he could respect. He began to notice subtle signs of her vulnerability too. Despite her strength, there were moments when exhaustion, fear, or frustration softened her tough exterior. He saw her comforting her sibling after a long day, whispering encouragement, soothing tears, and offering warmth in a home where resources were scarce but love was abundant. There was a humanity in her actions that no amount of wealth could ever replace. She was not perfect, but she was real, driven not by entitlement but by responsibility and care for those she loved. This glimpse into her life changed the way he viewed the world and perhaps even himself. For the first time in years, he questioned his assumptions about morality, luck, and the arbitrary advantages of wealth. He realized that the world was not divided simply into the successful and the unsuccessful, the righteous and the criminal. There were people like her, resilient, intelligent, and brave, whose circumstances forced them into difficult choices, yet whose hearts remained steadfast. He began to understand that the wallet incident was not just a theft. It was a window into a life of courage, sacrifice, and relentless struggle. The billionaire felt a strange mix of emotions: empathy, admiration, and an almost guilty fascination. He wanted to confront her, to ask questions, to understand the full story, but he also felt that this was a delicate balance. He had glimpsed a private world, one that belonged to her and her family. To intrude recklessly could destroy the trust or the fragile order she had built in her life. And yet, the more he watched, the more he realized he could not simply walk away. The encounter, the chase, the theft, it had all been a doorway into something larger, a chance to witness humanity in its rawest, most unfiltered form. By the end of this period of observation, he was no longer angry at her in the way he had been immediately after the theft. His anger had transformed into understanding, curiosity, and even admiration. She had stolen from him, yes, but in doing so, she had revealed the strength, determination, and depth of her character. The world, he realized, was not as simple as he had thought, and people were never simply good or bad. There were shades of survival, morality, and necessity that complicated every choice, and she was living proof of that complexity. And so, with this new understanding, he prepared himself for the next step, not just to recover what was his, but to confront the truth of her life, to see firsthand the courage that had driven her actions, and to step into a story far more human, raw, and profound than any he had ever experienced before. The chase had led him here, but it was the girl's life, her reality, that now captured his full attention and changed the way he saw everything. The moment came unexpectedly, almost like fate had orchestrated it. The billionaire had been observing from a discreet distance, following her daily routines without her knowledge, learning more about her world than he had ever imagined. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the first time he would see her up close, face to face, not as a shadow in the crowd, but as a real person with fears, hopes, and untold stories. It happened in a small, crowded marketplace near the edge of the city, a place where people bargained loudly, colors clashed, and the smells of spices and street food mingled in the air. He spotted her standing near a vendor, pretending to examine an item, but his sharp eyes immediately noticed the subtle tension in her posture. She was aware of him, he could tell, though she tried not to show it. Her hands were slightly clenched, her shoulders rigid, and her gaze flickered around, alert to every movement. She was cautious, ready, and fully aware that someone might be following her, but perhaps not expecting him. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he stepped forward. He did not run or yell. He simply walked calmly toward her, letting the crowd shield his presence until he was close enough that retreat was no longer an option. When she finally noticed him, her eyes widened slightly, but she did not panic. There was a moment of silence, a heartbeat suspended between two very different worlds. She studied him, the tailored suit, the quiet confidence, the intensity in his gaze, and in that instant she understood. This was not just any man. He was someone who commanded attention, someone who did not accept failure easily, someone who had now made her his focus. "Why did you take my wallet?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. There was no anger in the tone he used now, only a demand for honesty, a request for understanding. She looked at him, assessing, weighing her options, her mind racing. A simple lie could get her out of the immediate confrontation, but her instincts told her that he was different, that he was not the kind of person who would let things slide so easily. She decided to speak the truth, partially because she had little choice, partially because there was something in his eyes that made her feel he deserved it. "I needed it," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. "I didn't take it to hurt anyone. I had no other way." She paused, glancing around nervously as if expecting judgment, condemnation, or perhaps violence. But none came. His expression did not change, though inside, a storm of curiosity, surprise, and a strange admiration was building. He had anticipated anger, confrontation, perhaps even deceit. But not this honesty, this raw truth spilling from someone who had been nothing more than a fleeting figure in his life just days before. He listened as she spoke, piecing together fragments of her world. The long hours she worked, the responsibilities she carried for her family, the desperation that had driven her to take what was not hers. The billionaire, a man whose life had always been defined by calculated risks and controlled circumstances, felt a ripple of something unfamiliar: empathy. He could feel her struggle, her courage, and the silent sacrifices that had shaped her. And though she had technically committed a crime, he could see beyond that act to the person she was. The person he now realized was far more complex, far more resilient, than he had ever imagined. The marketplace bustled around them, oblivious to the silent confrontation unfolding in its midst. Vendors shouted, children ran past, and the clatter of daily life continued, but for the billionaire and the girl, time seemed to slow. In that suspended moment, the dynamics of their worlds collided. Wealth versus survival, control versus cunning, expectation versus reality. She had stolen from him, yet he found himself wanting to understand her, to see the truth that lay beneath the surface. And she, for her part, sensed a rare chance. Not for escape, not for further deception, but for recognition, for someone to see her story without judgment. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softer now, tinged with curiosity. "You risked a lot for this. Tell me, why?" She hesitated but then revealed a glimpse of the life she led. A life of hardship, of sacrifices made for someone else, a life where every decision carried weight and consequence. His anger, if it had existed, had melted away. What remained was fascination, an intense need to understand how someone could survive so fiercely, with so little, in a world that offered them almost nothing. The first confrontation ended without violence, without threats, and without even a complete resolution. She slipped away again into the crowd, disappearing as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving him standing in the marketplace, silent, thoughtful, and profoundly unsettled. The encounter had achieved something neither of them expected. It had transformed the chase into a connection, the theft into a doorway, and the act into a question of morality, humanity, and circumstance. For the billionaire, this moment marked the beginning of a new journey, not just a pursuit of a stolen wallet, but a pursuit of understanding, of truth, and of the unexpected depth of the girl who had so audaciously crossed his path. He knew he would see her again, not just to recover what was lost, but to uncover the layers of a life that had silenced him in ways he could not yet comprehend. And for her, the encounter had revealed a strange reality. Someone from a world so far removed from hers could see her, not as a thief but as a person. That understanding, though unspoken, would linger in both of their lives, setting the stage for revelations that would shock, humble, and transform him in ways he had never imagined. After their first tense encounter, the billionaire found himself consumed by questions he had never thought he would care about. Who was this girl? What had driven her to steal from him, and why had she been so fearless in the face of someone so obviously powerful? His curiosity was no longer casual. It had evolved into an almost obsessive need to understand her world. The wallet was only a doorway. The real story lay hidden behind her actions, waiting to be uncovered. He began his investigation with discretion. He did not want to alarm her, nor did he want to intrude recklessly into a life already filled with struggles. Instead, he observed quietly, blending into the background as she went about her day. He followed her from a distance, noting the alleyways she took, the shops where she stopped, the small gestures of kindness she showed to strangers, and the hurried pace that betrayed her constant worry. Every detail was a clue, each movement a piece of a puzzle that would eventually reveal the person behind the audacious theft. Through careful observation and discreet inquiries, he began to piece together a startling picture. She worked multiple jobs, some barely paying enough to cover rent, others physically exhausting and mentally draining. Yet she performed each task with a sense of dignity, even when those around her were dismissive or cruel. It was clear she had learned to survive by relying on her wits, her resilience, and an unwavering determination that refused to be broken by circumstance. The more he discovered, the more he realized that her life was defined not by choice, but by necessity. She lived in a tiny apartment that barely held her and a younger sibling, who depended on her for everything. The sibling was sick, fragile, and often in need of medical care that she struggled to afford. Each day she faced impossible decisions: pay for food or medicine, take a shortcut that might be risky, or work longer hours to ensure survival. Every choice carried weight, and every misstep could have devastating consequences. The billionaire felt a growing respect, and a pang of guilt, because he had never known such a burden. He also noticed the cleverness in her actions. Her theft of his wallet was not a reckless gamble, it was a calculated risk. He began to see patterns in her behavior, a logic in what initially seemed chaotic. She prioritized survival, yes, but she did so with an intelligence that suggested years of adaptation and keen observation of the world around her. Every step she took, every decision she made, reflected a mind honed by necessity and circumstance. He realized that this girl, who had seemed like a fleeting figure in his day, possessed a strength and wisdom far beyond her years. Yet it was not just her resilience that fascinated him, it was her compassion. Despite her hardships, she cared deeply for those around her. He watched her share what little she had with a neighbor, comfort her sibling after a long, exhausting day, and even offer quiet assistance to a stranger in need. There was a humanity in her actions that money could never buy, a generosity of spirit that seemed to grow in defiance of the difficulties she faced. The billionaire found himself reflecting on the stark contrast between their worlds. His life had been one of control, of calculated risk, of wealth shaping every decision. Her life was one of survival, of improvisation, and of a courage he had never fully understood. The deeper he dug, the more he realized the complexity of her situation. He uncovered layers of struggle that went far beyond petty theft. Debts from medical bills, constant worry about eviction, and a relentless fight to protect her family. Each revelation deepened his understanding and challenged his assumptions about morality, responsibility, and human strength. She had stolen his wallet, yes, but in the context of her life, it was a desperate act, one that spoke of necessity rather than malice. By the end of this period of observation, the billionaire was no longer just intrigued, he was moved. The girl had become a living testament to resilience, sacrifice, and courage. Every act, every decision, and every risk she took painted a picture of a life that demanded empathy and understanding. He realized that the encounter, which had started as a simple chase, had now transformed into a profound lesson about humanity. This realization sparked something within him, the desire to step further into her world, not to control it, but to understand it, and perhaps even to help where he could. He knew that the next steps would be delicate, requiring trust, patience, and care. But one thing was certain. The girl who had stolen his wallet had also stolen his attention, his respect, and, in a way, his heart. The chase was no longer about money. It was about truth, compassion, and uncovering the layers of a life that had been hidden from the world. And as he prepared to move closer, to learn more, he understood that the story he was about to discover would be far more powerful, and far more humbling, than he had ever anticipated. The city had a way of hiding people in plain sight, and yet, in the midst of its noise and chaos, a fragile connection was beginning to form between the billionaire and the girl he had once chased. What started as suspicion, anger, and curiosity had slowly transformed into something far more complex, a silent recognition of resilience, courage, and humanity. Neither of them realized it at first, but the invisible thread connecting their lives was growing stronger, stretching across differences of wealth, opportunity, and experience. It began subtly, with moments of observation that went beyond mere curiosity. The billionaire no longer watched her simply to understand the theft. He watched to understand her, to see the person beneath the actions. And she, sensing his quiet presence more than his physical nearness, felt a strange mix of wariness and curiosity. There was something different about him, not the typical wealthy men she had encountered, who saw people like her as problems to be solved or dismissed. He seemed interested in her story without judgment, in her choices without condescension. Their first real interaction after the initial confrontation came by accident. She was struggling with bags of groceries, trying to juggle them while keeping an eye on her younger sibling playing nearby. The billionaire, walking past, paused, instinctively stepping forward to offer assistance. She recoiled at first, suspicion flashing in her eyes, but the sincerity in his tone and the calm in his demeanor softened her instinctive resistance. He did not lecture, demand, or patronize. He simply helped, lifting the heavier bags and placing them on the edge of her small apartment entrance. It was a small gesture, almost inconsequential, yet it marked a turning point. In that moment, the girl realized that he could see her as more than just a thief, more than just a girl struggling in the shadows of society. He could see her as a person, resilient, resourceful, and human. And for the billionaire, this act was equally transformative. He had always dealt in numbers, strategies, and calculated risks, but here was a life untouched by privilege, yet overflowing with courage, determination, and dignity. Helping her was no longer just an impulse, it was a recognition of that strength, a silent acknowledgement of her worth. Over the following days, their interactions became more frequent, though still cautious. He would appear unexpectedly, offering help in small ways, a quiet payment to cover a medical bill, an anonymous delivery of groceries, or a tip for work that would ease her burdens. Each act was subtle, designed not to overwhelm or control, but to give her a lifeline. And each act was noticed. She began to recognize that someone from a world so distant from hers cared enough to act without expectation. Their conversations, when they happened, were tentative. She tested him with guarded questions, small stories, and partial truths, unsure of his intentions. He answered with patience, transparency, and a quiet respect that gradually broke down the walls she had built around herself. The billionaire learned to listen without judgment, to ask questions without intruding, and to observe without assuming. And slowly, a bond began to form, not romantic at first, but profound in a way that transcended social status, wealth, and circumstance. It was a bond built on mutual respect, understanding, and shared humanity. He began to understand the depth of her struggles, not just the visible hardships, but the silent battles fought in fear, hope, and exhaustion. Each revelation humbled him. The nights she went hungry so her sibling could eat, the countless hours she worked while sick herself, the relentless courage it took to face each day with dignity. And she, in turn, began to see that he was not just a wealthy outsider. He was someone capable of empathy, someone willing to acknowledge her humanity rather than her mistakes. The bond that grew between them was unexpected, delicate, and fragile. It did not erase their differences, nor did it simplify the complexities of their worlds. But it created a bridge, a connection that allowed them to meet even briefly in the middle of two vastly different lives. The billionaire began to realize that his fascination with her was no longer about curiosity or control. It was about respect, admiration, and a growing sense of responsibility. And for the girl, the bond represented something she had rarely experienced. Trust in someone who could have been a threat but instead chose to see her truth. By the end of this period, the dynamic between them had shifted entirely. He was no longer just a pursuer. He had become a silent guardian, a witness to her life, and someone whose presence offered support rather than intimidation. She was no longer just a thief. She had become a person whose courage and resilience demanded recognition, whose story deserved to be seen in full. And in this unexpected bond, both began to change. The billionaire learning humility and empathy, and the girl discovering that trust and human kindness could exist even in a world defined by struggle. What had begun as a chase for a stolen wallet had transformed into something far greater. A connection that bridged worlds, challenged assumptions, and hinted at a shared understanding neither of them had anticipated. It was fragile, unspoken, and complex, but it was real. And as their paths continued to intersect, both would soon discover that this bond was only the beginning of revelations that would silence him in ways he had never imagined and change both their lives forever. The billionaire had seen courage before, in boardrooms and battlefields of business, but nothing could have prepared him for the revelation that awaited. He had followed her story quietly, helped her discreetly, and grown to understand the struggles that shaped her life. Yet he was about to uncover a truth so profound, so deeply human, that it would leave him utterly silent. Something no amount of wealth, power, or control could prepare him for. It began on a rainy afternoon, when he learned that she had taken a risk far greater than he had imagined. He had heard vague hints from neighbors, fragments of conversations that spoke of illness, of desperation, of unthinkable choices. But he had not truly understood the stakes, not until he decided to see her world firsthand, not as an observer, but as someone willing to understand fully. He arrived at her small, dimly lit apartment just as she returned from a long day of work. The air inside was thick with the faint smell of antiseptic and cleaning supplies. Her younger sibling lay on the small bed, pale and trembling, clutching a worn blanket. Machines beeped softly, indicating the presence of medical equipment that the girl had somehow managed to afford through tireless effort and sacrifice. The scene hit him like a physical blow. Every hardship, every small act of cunning, every stolen wallet now made sense in a way that no mere explanation could convey. She looked at him warily, unsure if he had come to scold, question, or confront her. But he did neither. He simply watched as she knelt beside her sibling, checking the tubes, the temperature, the small movements that indicated life and fragility in equal measure. Her hands were steady, precise, and tender, hands that had stolen his wallet, yes, but also hands that were holding life itself together. Finally, the truth emerged, softly, almost in passing. "I needed the money," she said quietly, eyes focused on her sibling. "The medicine, it's expensive. Without it they wouldn't survive. I didn't have any other way." She did not ask for forgiveness, did not seek sympathy. She stated it as a fact, as someone who had faced impossible choices her whole life. The weight of her words struck him with a force that left him speechless. The audacity of her theft now revealed itself not as a crime of greed, but as an act of love, desperation, and courage beyond measure. The billionaire could feel his own world shifting in that instant. Every assumption he had made, every judgment, every mental calculation about right and wrong, morality and legality, dissolved under the weight of her truth. She had risked so much, stolen from someone of immense power, not to gain luxury but to preserve life itself. And in doing so, she had revealed a depth of humanity he had rarely witnessed. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything that could bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. But no words came. His voice, usually calm, authoritative, and precise, failed him. He realized that some truths are too profound for language, too raw for explanation. The silence between them became a shared understanding, one that required no dialogue, only recognition. In that quiet, he felt humility wash over him. All his wealth, all his influence, all his carefully constructed life meant nothing against the simple raw truth of human courage. She had lived a lifetime of sacrifice in a few short years, making impossible choices with unflinching determination. The stolen wallet, once the source of his anger, now seemed trivial compared to the enormity of her struggle. For her, the silence was different. She looked at him with guarded relief, sensing that he understood, that he was not judging, not threatening, but acknowledging. She did not need his pity or his help yet. She needed recognition for the life she had fought so hard to preserve. And in that moment, the billionaire understood that what had begun as a chase, as a pursuit for something material, had transformed into something immeasurably deeper. A confrontation with truth, morality, and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. That truth silenced him not just in words but in soul. It was a silence born of awe, respect, and a profound realization that life, in all its complexity, often defies simple understanding. The girl who had stolen his wallet had revealed more than a crime. She had revealed the weight of survival, the depth of sacrifice, and the extraordinary courage of someone fighting for love rather than wealth. And in that moment, the billionaire knew that everything would change. His anger, his assumptions, and even his pursuit of her had transformed into a recognition of humanity at its rawest and most inspiring form. The truth was not just her secret. It had become a mirror reflecting what truly mattered, a lesson in empathy, humility, and the power of compassion that no fortune could ever buy. The encounter ended not with confrontation, but with understanding. He left her apartment quietly, carrying a new awareness of the fragile, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking complexity of life. The silence lingered, heavy yet liberating, a silence that spoke louder than words ever could, a silence that would shape his actions, his heart, and the choices he would make in the days to come. After the revelation that had silenced him, the billionaire returned to his world, a world of opulence, high-powered meetings, and endless obligations. But he was no longer the same man who had walked those crowded streets weeks ago. The memory of her courage, her sacrifice, and the raw honesty of her life lingered with him, reshaping the way he saw people, privilege, and purpose. Every decision, every interaction in his previously controlled life now carried a new perspective, colored by the human story he had witnessed. He could not stop thinking about her, not as the girl who had stolen his wallet, but as the young woman who had risked everything to save a life. Each time he replayed that moment, the quiet confession in her dimly lit apartment, the vulnerable glance toward her sibling, he felt a mixture of awe, respect, and a profound humility. For the first time, he understood that wealth and power could never replace compassion, courage, or the kind of resilience forged by necessity and love. He began to act carefully, subtly, respecting the boundaries of her world while offering support she had never experienced before. His first step was practical, ensuring her sibling had access to the medical care they desperately needed. Doctors, specialists, and treatment plans, all arranged without her ever feeling indebted or exposed. He sent help anonymously at first, not to impress or control, but to give her space while lifting some of the weight that had pressed so heavily on her young shoulders for years. But the billionaire did not stop at practical help. He began to engage with her life in ways that went beyond assistance. Quiet gestures, a book left at her door, a small note of encouragement, the occasional delivery of necessities, gradually built trust. She, in turn, began to lower the walls she had built so carefully over a lifetime of hardship. She no longer saw him as merely an observer, an outsider, or a potential threat. She began to see him as an ally, someone who had chosen to step into her world not to control it, but to honor it, and in doing so, someone who could understand her story without judgment. The bond between them deepened, evolving from tentative understanding to mutual respect, and finally to a partnership of sorts. They communicated without words at times, a shared glance, a quiet acknowledgement, a small act of care, and slowly they began to understand each other in ways that transcended social class, experience, or circumstance. He marveled at her ability to navigate life's harshest challenges with dignity, intelligence, and humor, and she recognized that he had the wisdom and patience to see her as a person, not just a story, not just a lesson, not just a fleeting figure in his life. The billionaire's life itself began to change as a result of her influence. Decisions at work, interactions with colleagues, and even his own self-perception shifted. He became more empathetic, more aware of the struggles hidden behind faces in the crowd, and more conscious of the impact his actions could have beyond the balance sheets and bottom lines. In learning about her life, he learned about humanity in its rawest form, the courage, vulnerability, and resilience that no amount of money could replicate. For her part, life became a little less heavy, but not because it was easy. It was lighter because someone finally saw her, truly saw her. Not just her struggles, but her strength, her intelligence, her love, and her determination. She no longer had to fight alone in the shadows. The billionaire's presence, careful and respectful, became a quiet anchor, allowing her to breathe, to plan, and to focus on building a future for herself and her sibling without losing the integrity and dignity she had fought so hard to maintain. In the months that followed, their worlds, once separated by wealth, experience, and circumstance, began to intersect more fully. She learned to trust, to accept help without shame, and to allow herself moments of relief. He learned humility, compassion, and the quiet satisfaction that comes not from dominance, control, or wealth, but from recognizing and uplifting the courage and resilience of others. Together, in ways subtle yet profound, they reshaped each other's lives. The story ended not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet transformation. The billionaire no longer saw life as a series of calculations and conquests. The girl no longer faced the world alone, weighed down by impossible responsibilities. Their encounter, the chase, the confrontation, the revelations, and the unexpected bond, had led to a new beginning. A life where respect, understanding, and human connection mattered more than wealth, power, or judgment. As they stood side by side one evening, watching the city bustle around them, neither needed words to express the change that had occurred. The stolen wallet, once a symbol of conflict and anger, had become a reminder of resilience, courage, and the profound impact of compassion. And in that shared silence, they both understood that sometimes, the most extraordinary journeys begin in the most ordinary, unexpected ways, and that true human connection can transform lives in ways money and power never could.